Hello students, and welcome to the first part of the lecture videos on Chapter 7, which is Issues of the Gilded Age, and we are discussing the years 1877 to 1900. Now to begin with, we need to discuss what the term gilded means. We discussed this last chapter, but we're going to revisit it again here. Gilded means that something is covered in a thin layer of gold, but what is just beneath that thin layer is something that is not very valuable. And people said that's what American society was like. They said if you looked at us, it looked like we had a few very wealthy individuals that made the entire society look wealthy. But if you look just a little bit deeper, we weren't worth what we look like from the outside. So that's why it's called the Gilded Age. So we're going to talk first about segregation and social tensions. As you know, in 1876, Reconstruction was officially ended when Rutherford B. Hayes was elected president. He had promised to remove the military leaders from the South, and when he was elected, he did so. And immediately, as soon as that happened, the South began to take rights away from blacks. And one way they did this was to institutionalize racism, which means that they made racism legal and according to their laws, and made codes that would force the separation of the races. These laws were called Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws was legal separation of the races, making it a law that blacks and whites had to be separated in nearly every aspect of society. The 15th Amendment was passed right after the Civil War, guaranteeing that blacks had the right to vote. However, this was not enforced in the South. The South didn't want African Americans to vote. Therefore, they had four main ways that they got around the 15th Amendment. And remember, Reconstruction was over, so there was no Northern force inside of the South making sure that they complied with these orders. Number one is the poll tax. They made voters pay a tax in order to vote. This kept African Americans from voting because they were extremely poor. They were poor because they'd been in slavery for generations, so this kept them from voting. It also kept poor white people from voting. Number two, they would give literacy tests. These were tests to see that you could read or write. If you couldn't pass the test, you couldn't vote. Again, African Americans had not had education for generations, so many could not read. Southerners knew this, and so they put the literacy test in place to keep them from voting. We have what is also called the grandfather clause. It said a person could vote only if their grandfather could vote before 1866. Obviously, no African American's grandfather could vote before 1866 in the South because they had been a slave. So this was intended to keep all African Americans from voting. And finally, we had violence. Groups such as the KKK would stand at polling places and threaten blacks that would try to vote. The South was so segregated that they had segregated jury boxes, Bibles to swear the oath on when you were about to testify in court, cemeteries, restaurants, and hospitals. This seems unbelievable to us today, but it was the reality to those living during that time. One of the Supreme Court cases that was very famous during this time is the court case Plessy versus Ferguson. In this case, a person that was part African American, part white, had tried to sit in the white section of a train car. He was forced to move. He sued the government, and it made it all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said in Plessy versus Ferguson that Jim Crow laws were constitutional. They said that it was okay to have separate facilities for blacks and whites as long as they were equal. This created what became known as the separate but equal doctrine. Now, this would have been okay except for the fact that the facilities for African Americans were never equal. They were always worse than those for the whites. However, this Supreme Court case upheld Jim Crow laws, and they existed for about another 100 years, 90 to 100 years in the South. Now, there were some African Americans during this time that stood up for these injustices. The first one that we're going to talk about is Booker T. Washington. He was actually born a slave in 1856, and he said that blacks should achieve equality by increasing their education, saving money and increasing their wealth, and not fighting the system, but using the system in order to better themselves and to earn a place in society. He established a college called Tuskegee Institute, which was primarily for African Americans, to help blacks get that education that he felt that they needed. In contrast was W.E.B. Du Bois. Now, Du Bois also wanted African Americans to have the same rights as everyone else, but he differed in how he thought they should go about it. He was very educated. He'd earned a PhD from Harvard in 1896, which was very rare for an African American during that time. However, he said blacks should demand full and immediate freedoms and not follow Washington's plan of gradually earning their way into society. He said they should demand full and immediate freedoms now and should work to that end and to try to get that. So they both had the same goal, Du Bois and Washington, but they had a difference in how they thought African Americans should go about attaining that goal. Thank you for watching part 1, and you have a great day.